Welcome to the Cycling in Alignment podcast, an examination of cycling as a practice and dialogue about the integration of sport in right relationship to your life.
Greetings and salutations, Space Monkeys. Before we begin our episode, a brief reminder that this podcast depends on support from the audience. The reason I am able to continue with this project is because of the support of patrons. If you are a member of my audience and you feel I have offered you insight or added value to your cycling journey, please consider a visit to my website, colbypierce.com, where you can make a contribution to the Cycling in Alignment podcast. You can support the show for as little as $8 for a one-time contribution, or choose to subscribe as an ongoing member. Thank you for your consideration. Here's your reminder to think critically, act intuitively, and pedal consciously. Greetings, well dippers. This is the second part of my conversation with strength and conditioning coach Menachem Brodie. If you missed part one, feel free to start here, but you won't have the full picture until you listen to the first part of our discourse. Hopefully this conversation reminds you to move consciously, if nothing else. You may have heard of Menachem on the Fast Talk Labs podcast, or read some of his writing on the Pez Cycling News website. Maybe you've seen his book, Strength Training for Performance Cycling. If you want to know more about Menachem's work, be sure to check out his website, Human Vortex Training. As always, I hope you find our conversation insightful. Be well.
All right, we just hit record because we already started. You guys missed like half the podcast. Well, technically you did.
If you started here, you did, yeah. Cool.
If you started here, you're wrong. No, just kidding. All right, so we're back with Colby Pierce. We were just talking about the pelvis position. So if you guys missed it, haven't listened to the previous episode, both Colby and I are posting it on our podcast, so make sure you pick that up. Cycling in Alignment is his. The Strong Savvy Cyclist and Triathlete is mine. But last time we talked about, we joked about it, but the practical perspective of how do we make strength actionable, right? And we were just talking about the pelvis. So let's jump into it, man. So we were just talking about nutation and counter-nutation of the pelvis. So for the listeners out there, nutation is where you're in anterior pelvic tilt, and counter-nutation is where you're in posterior pelvic tilt. And that...
correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that it's when the innominate are rotated relative to the sacrum.
Correct, right. So I'm trying to make it like really low level, but that is technically correct because it's three different pieces for the pelvis, right? So you have the right side, left side. Yep. So Colby got the technical side of things, and that's really important because you walk in and you're like, oh, nutation, counter nutation. Your therapist will be like, no, you heard that on the interwebs, didn't you?
Right.
So let's talk about, or get back into the conversation of when we're talking about pelvic position, what are some of the considerations that we have for your actual performance?
Right. So from my perspective, when I'm looking at an athlete in standing and I'm watching them move, I'm watching them do their lunges, their forward lunges or their squats or walking and gait, I'm trying to sort of deduce what their movement pattern is, what their strategy is for making power. Right. Or handling force, making force or handling force. That is generating force intrinsically or dealing with forces that are applied extrinsically. Right. And I'm looking to see if they have excessive anterior rotation, which would be forward tipping in the pelvis. So the generic example we hear is imagine your pelvis is like a bowl of soup. And if you're pouring the soup out on your toes, that would be anterior tilt. And everyone has normally an amount of anterior tilt to their pelvis. The normative ranges that Paul Chek uses in his system, if we measure the ASIS to the PSIS, which are really the two bony markers on the front and back of the pelvis, there's two on each side, there's four total. If we measure the angle in those, the front is always lower in a healthy pelvis than the rear. And in males, I believe it's 4 to 7 degrees is normal. And in females, it's around 7 to 10 degrees of the normative ranges. And so there is a little bit of anterior tilt to the pelvis, which would give you normally coupled with a normal, a lumbar curve that would have a little bit of arch to it, right? And So if I see someone who's biased towards anterior rotation, they've got more anterior rotation than I would say is normative in standing, or when they default to those postures under load, what that informs me or tells me about is that their nervous system feels safe to make power in that position, right? And we can start to infer certain patterns of tension in their muscular system and their fascial system from those postures, right? And these postures aren't good or bad. It's not good for someone to be anterior rotated or bad for someone to be posteriorly rotated, but they tend to cause challenge over time, especially when they gravitate way out of normative ranges, right? That's why there are normative ranges. And there's a real tension there for me as a bike fitter, because retool is based on normative ranges, right? That's what it is. It's a system that looks at bell curves. And I think we have to be quite cautious with applying those numbers, because the only rule in bike fitting, as I think I mentioned in the first episode that Steve Hogg taught me, is there are no rules in bike fitting. Every single human is unique. And so what good are normative ranges if we really embrace that philosophy? Well, there's some of both. There's a middle path here, because if we see someone come in and they've got this extreme anterior pelvic tilt, then we know that's going to put a lot of strain into their lumbar spine, most likely, right? And they could be heavily reliant on certain muscle chains or fascial chains and not using other ones at all. And if they're in a repetitive sport like cycling, and you rely too much on one area of the body, one group of muscles, or one particular, there's a really intense focus or foci of force or tension in certain areas, then we know what happens. Those muscles just get blown out and fatigued and smashed. You either cramp, or you just can't go any faster because they're locked up, or something bad happens, or you get injured, right? And so we want to load share in a repetitive sport. We want to train our athletes to have the fascial integrity to load share. And this can happen in anterior rotation or posterior rotation. And one side note I'll say is that I've, listening to a lot of podcasts with PTs and body workers and these types of people, I think they very commonly see people who come into their clinic. From my understanding, it's more common for people who see gen pop, we'll say, general population, who come in with an anterior rotation bias. And they would offer that that's from sitting all day. That doesn't quite make sense to me, because when I see most people sit, they actually roll back in posterior posture. And I would say on average, I see more cyclists that are more oriented or stuck in even posterior pelvic tilt. Some of that is because a lot of bike saddles, cycling bike seats, are really poorly made. They don't allow anterior rotation effectively without a huge increase in perineal pressure. And so cyclists can become trained to sit in posterior rotation because they're basically dealing with pressure in their genitals. Men or women, same, can be either way, either sex. This can be a problem for either sex, either gender. And so sometimes, that's where the movement screen gets really interesting. You see someone who really defaults to a neutral posture, or maybe even they're quite anteriorly rotated. They really have a nice hip hinge, and they're squatting really low, and they're deadlifting really well, and they're lunging really well, and they've got good control, and their glutes are firing. And then they get on the bike and they're sitting, with that pelvis tucked back. Well, the first place I would think to look there is, they probably got a saddle that isn't agreeing with their desire to rotate forward into that anterior position. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's one of the challenges we have is we're very much in a society that likes to just blame the simple thing. Like, don't eat highly processed food. Well, it depends. Like, did you just finish like Leadville 100? Like, yeah, go and eat bags and bags of Cheetos. Make sure you drink enough water, but you need calories, right? So there's like that time. With the sitting, exactly what you pointed out is that most I have anterior pelvic tilt because I ride my bike a lot. Like the way you ride your bike, that doesn't actually make sense. You're orienting your pelvis a certain way. And most people, exactly what you're talking about, they round their back and they slouch back. So it just leads to a misalignment. It's more of the femoral head in the acetabulum that's getting bullied around. And then the pelvic floor essentially locks down, right? And then that's where you get that anterior pelvic tilt, because you just don't have the integrity of the system of the core. And core is everything between the neck, elbows, and knees. And this is where it drives me insane that people are like, my core, my stomach. Like, dude, I don't know about you, but I hang my hands or hold my hands on the handlebar when I ride, and they're kind of important, not just for eating. Like, you got to look at all of it. So one, yes, two, absolutely about the saddles, and three, when you look at how someone's sitting, though, do you see a frequent bias, like you had mentioned before, about how you'll see that the left pelvis will kind of they shift over just a little bit? Like, are you seeing that the one hip joint is bullying the other and kind of driving that orientation of the pelvis, or do you feel like it's just a full-on adaptation to going from sitting on a ill-fitted or ill-designed bike seat to everyday life?
Um, that's a good question. It takes me to a little bit of our earlier discussion about, you go to some PTs or some different modalities of therapy, we'll say, and people think in terms of muscular tension, and they're thinking about length tension relationships, and they get very specific. It's like, well, the serratus is tight here, or the, whatever, pick your muscle, the obturator is really tight here, and that's doing this and pulling this joint that way and preventing you from moving this way. And that's not a bad way to think. For me, going through the check system, especially in IMS 3 and 4, there's a lot of assessments that Paul gives. I think we get up to well over 100 different assessments you can look at. And a lot of them are table test style, and some of them are a little more dynamic or active. But some of them are nerve glide tests and things like this. But my mind just doesn't quite think that way. I think I'm a little more on your side of things, which is we got to zoom out and look at the tension. Understanding anatomy is important, and we have to understand what muscles go where and how we generate force. But at the same time, when you see a movement pattern, it's not an individual muscle normally that is the problem, it's the area. And that includes the fascial connection, the fascial matrix between all those muscles. And so I look very generally at that. And if I'm a therapist and I'm treating specific muscular areas, or we have adhesions, that's one thing, right? Or if I'm an acupuncturist, then I have to know the points, of course. And I learn a lot of these points in Qigong, so that's maybe a bit more nuanced. But I think it's useful for us to not get too hung up into the minutia. And the other part that comes into that a bit is PRI, if you know their work, that's Postural Restoration Institute. And I think these guys are quite smart, and they're onto a lot of stuff, and they talk about this bias as well. And here's my theory, so I'll throw this out there, and feel free to tell me if you agree or disagree or have no idea or whatever. But they posit that there's sort of a standard male posture, like guys are standing around in a group, talking smack or whatever. And what they do is they kind of hitch themselves up on their left leg. And when that leg is loaded, that SIJ will be under tension, which will normally orient it towards a bit of posterior rotation. And that sets up a twist and a torsion in the entire body that you can see tip of the head all the way to the toes, right? And if you stand that way a lot, then that pattern gets reinforced, right? And those fascial lines become reinforced, and you get that twisting pattern. And I think that same pattern manifests on the bike. And how I would interpret that is when you're standing around with your buddies, if we imagine tribally, like, why would the nervous system default to this type of pattern? Well, if you're right side dominant and you're standing in a group of buddies and a saber-tooth tiger walks around the corner, or a mama bear comes, a grizzly bear or whatever, you got to run. Your first step's going to be with your dominant side. That's your right quad, right? That's fight or flight. I'm out of here. Or another tribe comes and shows up with a bunch of spears. Same thing. It's like we run to the yurt and grab our swords or whatever you're doing. And so that right side is like armed and ready. It's your punch. And that means the left side gets the default sort of lazy posture. And it also means that in your stance, you're going to be, like this. And when we look at that right side dominance, really, I think of it as a punch with the right quad. So how that manifests on the bike is, imagine you're riding on someone's wheel in the group, and they are exhibiting this classic spiral pattern, this counterclockwise spiral. Again, that's to review, that's counterclockwise, because if we looked at the rider from space and put a clock on their head, they'd be rotating in a counterclockwise direction. So right SIJ or right iliac crest or right hip would be kind of coming forward and shifting down, following the foot. It's almost like the right hip follows the foot through the pedal stroke. It drags. And as a result of that, there's more movement in the right SIJ, and more movement in general in the entire right innominate. And so I guess if you were to say, to use your word bullying, I think the right side would be the bully in this case, because I think it's the right quad that is overactive, more engaged than we want relative to the rest of the system. It's relative. Doesn't mean you've got too much quad on its own. So we can handle that different ways. We could increase our left quad and increase both posterior chain and increase right posterior chain, and you might have a really nice balanced pedal stroke. Or you could say, well, we need less right quad. I kind of don't think that's going to work neurologically, because it's pretty embedded. You're standing around that group of guys, and you really want to smack it on a climb or smash it over a roller or bridge across to a group in a race. You need that, right? That's your punch. That's your yang. That's your doing things. So I think we have to upregulate the other side, and we have to make sure that the left SIJ and left innominate doesn't get too locked. So we end up with this paradigm where the left side sort of gets stuck and glued, gets sticky, right? Doesn't glide. And then the right side has a little more WD-40 going on, and we maybe need a little more organization to the right side. And so my current line of thinking is that really focuses on engaging more posterior chain on the right side, especially focused on glute, and integrating the plantar surface of the foot. That's the underside of the right foot through the ankle to stiffen the right ankle, which helps connect that whole chain. I think I kind of answered your question.
Yeah, that's I'm a big fan of PRI. I haven't gone through any of their full courses. They have hard timelines, and just with 2 young kids, I just can't. It's like 3 months or 4 months now, because right before our firstborn was joined us, I thought about it, and it was like, it seemed expensive at the time. My coach at the time had just shared with me like some of the stuff from them, and I'm like, oh, this is really good. I was like, I like this stuff. This is cool. Yeah. And then I looked, and I was like, anyhow, I regret not doing it, because now it's like, man, you got to be on for it. And that's why they do it, is because they know if you don't have a timeline, you have to dive head in. Anyhow, that's back onto your point. I think it's kind of what we talked about the first part of the episode with Bill Hartman talks about getting spun to the right. And that's, I like where you're thinking, how that has become like a embedded default essentially for males. It makes sense, right? Because I think about the guys that I have that are left-handed, they lean to the right. So I'm like, man, Colby's just telling the truth, man. That really is like so innate. You don't even think about it. On the other side, though, something that I got really involved in when I was going through my back pain and learning about it is the orientation of the hip socket, right? So between the two of us, there's 4 hips, and one of those 4 is going to have a differentiation in the femoral neck angle of between 10 and 15 degrees, which is pretty massive. Plus, it can be oriented more towards the front, anteverted or retroverted, and that has a huge impact on cycling as well. And this is where, like, I think there's a much more important place to start people, cyclists in particular and triathletes, bipedal and equal support for squatting and moving weight, because it gets you to see like, how are they dealing with this force, like what's moving, what's not moving. But the eye to pick that up off the bike. On the bike, it's pretty simple. Once you watch it, and these days with the camera quality, like just do a slow motion on your iPhone or your Pixel phone and you can pick up the shift. But in strength training, seeing those subtle shifts, like the knees in particular. I remember 2 years ago, one of the younger coaches here came and was watching the strength training, and he'd done some sessions. He felt like he knew what he was talking about. He's like, oh, her knee's falling in, so you need to tell her to push her knee out. I was like, no. And I was like, think about the arch between your little toe and your big toe, and I want you to keep it up. And like everything cleaned up immediately, right? Because it's pulling attention to the interaction with the floor, as opposed to thinking about the knee, which is just an end result of something not working in between.
Yes.
So what I'm getting at here for the listeners, I think, Colby, you're following me, is you have so many considerations here. It's not just the plantar surface of the foot and the glute driving it, but it's also everything in between and how that's going to interact based on the hip socket orientation, the dominance of movement pattern. And that's where that bipedal, like doing a goblet squat with 2 feet flat on the ground, and then you play with, okay, let's point right toes out a little bit. Let's turn your left toes out. Let's try your right toe in. And you play with them and see how that affects the hip. There's some really cool stuff you can pick up that really makes it obvious what you got to do on the bike. Like, oh, we're going to do an outside the shoe wedge and we're going to wedge you in. Like, why would you do that? Like, here's your squat before. Here's when we turn your toe in. Voila, it's clean. I don't have to do anything. We're just fighting your body. It's not working right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, did we talk last time about GOTA? Are you familiar with GOTA?
If we did, I didn't write it down, and I think I would have written it.
I don't think we did. So, GOTA is a really interesting movement system. Have you had a chance to explore that much, or are you familiar with it? Okay. So I did a podcast with one of their instructors, Ricky Stanzi, and I did study some GOTA for a while. PRI is on my list also at some point. We'll see if we get there, but I'm definitely a lifelong student. But GOTA is really interesting. It's sort of like their methodology was sort of like Steven Seiler, but for movement. Meaning, what Seiler did, if you're familiar with his work, is he, instead of asking the question, okay, we're training for the Tour de France or whatever 190K road race. Let's reverse engineer the demands of this road race and then build a training program around that. That's the kind of traditional coaching mindset, I would say. That's the baseline. What Seiler did is threw all that out and said, let's just look at how the best athletes in the world are self-selecting. What does their intensity look like? So he took data from, I think, 4 sports, cross-country running, skate skiing, cycling, and rowing. And he just threw all the data, world level athletes, world championship and above, at Olympic level. And he threw all the data in a pile and he broke it down into really simple 3 zones. And he said, okay, what's the distribution? And this is where polarized training was basically, this is where the argument for this was created, right? And it was 80 or 90% of their training was really easy. And then 10 to 20% of it was eyeballs bleeding and almost nothing in the middle. And everyone was like, whoa, revolutionary. And I think that was a really valuable contribution to the coaching world. Whether or not that's applicable to amateur athletes, totally different discussion, but definitely valuable information. And I like Seiler's work a lot. So GOTA kind of did the same thing, but with movement. So they took certain classes of movers and they analyzed video in slow motion. And they asked the question, are there global laws to these types of people? What gives them longevity? And to be fair, their user groups were biased, the people they chose to look at. So they looked at infants, really, really successful world level masters athletes, like in their 80s and 90s, the highest level world-class athletes, period, like Jordan, Simone Biles, and tribal peoples, like people untarnished by chairs and cars. And they asked the question, are there commonalities between their movement patterns? And from that, they deduced that there were 7 global laws. And then part of their philosophy is that they didn't really come up with these laws. They observed them, right? They didn't create them. They just watched them and figured out the common denominators. And then they also looked at people who had known injury histories or repeated injuries. And they asked the question, what's the difference? What's the separator? And so they came up with GOTA, greatest of all time actions, and WOTA, worst of all time actions, right? And for me, this system makes a lot of sense. It's a little bit like when I first went to Steve and I came home after training with him in Sydney for a month as a bike fitter. I went on every group ride and all I could see was pelvic hip drop and, wobbly knees and, this and that. GOTA's like that for me now too. I can see movement patterns really clearly. Their education system is quite good. I'll give them props. They really nail it in terms of actionable advice and practical take homes. And they would offer that largely the foot, I won't break down their global laws or anything. If people want to go investigate, they certainly can. And there's great Instagram content from them. And I have a great pod from them as well, but they've got tons of content out there. But what they offer is that basically in all cases, the feet are more or less parallel to the direction of travel. And they think in terms of movement being spirals and waves, pressure waves. And just as when you increase pressure in the lungs, they inhale. When you increase pressure on a muscular system, it should expand. And when you expand in a lower leg under force, it externally rotates. It does not internally rotate, right? It doesn't collapse. That's collapse. So, and that's not to be confused with supination or just pointing your knees out, right? Those are 2 different things. One is an organized pressure wave. The other is artificially applying, this to your knees. They might kind of look the same, but you'll see it quickly if you can't really do it. So for whatever that's worth, I've really, for a long time, like I went to Steve and, Steve, you probably know this, but Steve has a patented method he uses to determine people's, the subtleties of their wedging and what works for their nervous system. And to be honest, I'm not using that very often anymore. I'm more taking time to coach people on the pressure sensitivity or the pressure sensations we want them to experience at the plantar surface of the foot, and how do we get them to drive with that. And Steve and I have gone back and forth on that quite a bit. He's like, well, I want to give my clients a solution on the day. And I definitely identify with that mindset, especially for someone who's been injured for a while. But I'm also, here's where I struggle with the table tests, and here I struggle with the releases and the little bit of, we're going to move your shoulder here. And if you get a little chiro out of it by accident, that's great, or whatever. Like, I'm not a practitioner. I don't want to treat people. I want to educate people, right? I'm teaching people how to fish all day long. That's just my passion. Nothing, the world works in different ways, and other people have to do what calls them to help serve others. And for some people, that is massage, or that is body work, or that is chiropractic, or whatever it may be, or cupping, or, rolfing. But for me, I'm a teacher. So anyway, people come in and like, oh, how many wedges should I use? I'm like, let's look at your feet. Where do you feel pressure under your feet? Let's look at your stance. Let's look at the relationship. One of the core tenets of Goda is inside ankle bone high, which means the medial malleolus, the inside ankle bone, has to be above the lateral malleolus, which basically puts you close to subtalar neutral, or more oriented towards subtalar neutral, and requires a domed arch with enough fascial and muscular integrity to handle load while you're walking, running, lifting. Most cyclists don't have this, in my experience. And they think that they can get it from a bunch of wedges and a stiff footbed. This drives me a bit nuts.
That makes two of us, man. And that's exactly what I was talking about with with what the other coach who thought he kind of understood what to do, like, oh, drive the knee out. Like, that's one of the things that I really hated. There's a specific to remain nameless course that I took that really means well to like help triathlon coaches, and like, if you see this, do this, and this exercise correlates with the downward phase of the pedaling stroke. I'm like, it depends. Like, who's the athlete? How are they pedaling? Where is their foot in space? Where is their pelvis in space? How are they holding themselves up? How are they breathing?
Yeah.
Right. There are all these considerations. And I that's exactly what I was getting at with the girl I was correcting her squat. Like, feel the I didn't say this, but essentially feel the transversal arch on the bottom of your foot. I took her shoes off. Like, most of the time we squat, we do jumps without. And the jumps, I had a hard time because the velodrome is cold because it's partially open and it's like 50 degrees. So that the tissues aren't quite where they need to be. But anyhow, essentially barefoot, and you see the eyes light up like, oh, wow, that's really cool. How'd you do that? It's like, everything is a spiral down to the ground. So if your knee is falling in, you're not creating a spiral. And it was clear as day. You look at the foot interacting with the ground, there's nothing. It's like taking a floppy pancake and just throwing it on the ground, right? And cyclists are horrible at this. And I think part of it's because we put our feet into these wonderfully, heavily reinforced carbon fiber plates, which are awesome for actually putting force down and not dissipating force. But you've lost the whole impact of, where's my foot in space? How is it moving? How does it need to feel? Right. Mm-hmm. And there's Base Camp, which I work with. We did toe yoga. I introduced them to toe yoga, which Casey Hill introduced me to, which I had done with my CrossFitter just because she was really big into like the what were they called? The Innovate finger feet. And I was like,
the Vibrams here.
Vibrams, yeah. Not as big on them, but like pretty good, right?
Yeah, I wear these things all the time.
So I kind of lost a little bit of love for them, just for two reasons. One is I found that like just the regular flat, the regular flat ones without the spacing, because some people get really distracted by that, but in the webbing, it's like so sensitive, right? Because that's the one part. It's kind of like it's like your armpits. Why do they tickle? Well, the nerve endings are there, and you don't really touch it a lot.
You know Helen Hall by any chance? She's a British running coach, and she has this ridiculously sensitive running treadmill situation that measures force but she talks a lot about how people, when they have tickly feet, sorry to interject here, but this is right on exactly where you're going. When they have overly sensitive feet, or if you're an adult and you still have ticklish feet, this will tell, in Helen's opinion, this is a lack of infant development. This is a default in infant development, right? This tells you your nervous system is too sensitive and your feet haven't engaged enough different tactile surfaces to properly engage the nervous system and understand proprioceptively where you are in space. So she has this exercise where you wipe your bare feet on like a welcome mat, like a nubby or a kind of scrubby, mud mat for 2 minutes at a pop to desensitize your feet and wake up the nervous system and get that sense. I mean, and when I did a podcast with her, it was probably a year and a half ago now. She's a brilliant woman. A lot of really nice content on Instagram. I told her the same thing you just said to me, which was, I said, cyclists really, we have this proprioceptive dead zone because our feet are sort of locked. We get this little bit of toe spring. It's kind of this weak windlass mechanism, right? We got a little bit of arch going on, but then we have this upper that's always made out of fake synthetic, naga hide or whatever, and it's clamping down our feet, and we're over tightening, and the shoes are usually too small, and everything's just kind of jammed in there like this dead porpoise, right? And after a while, you just lose sensation there. No wonder cyclists are lousy at squatting with bare feet, or their feet aren't awake or active, right? Yeah. It just shuts that down. She really didn't like that because she's in love with the foot, and she's like, oh, but there's so many pressure sensors and all types of sensory input comes into the feet. And my point was, I didn't really make this well effectively on the podcast at the time, but I was like, yeah, but cycling shoes shut all that off.
Yeah, especially these days. And the heel cup, these are 15 years old. I'm kind of embarrassed, but they're my favorite shoes. The Ergo 2s, just awesome. But the heel cup broke off the other day right before a ride. And I actually found that my sensations in my foot were much better because it locked it in place, right? It's locking that calcaneus in place. So you lose that connection with the arch. So I went back to using them. I went to the old CDs, but exactly to your point, which is like, there's so much that when you look at human nature and you put us on a bike, the things that we've done that just kill the energy return, like, you're not pedaling in flats because you don't want to have, the Cat 6 tat on the back of your leg, but you've also lost the ability to load the longitudinal arch, to load the medial arch. Joel Smith has a great course called Elastic Essentials. He's Just Fly Sports. So for anybody looking to learn about this, that's it's a lower cost of entry. Joel did a great job producing this. I just pulled it open. That's what you may have heard in the background. But he goes through all this, and he spends like the first 2 or 3 sections of like talking about the proprioceptive methods to train the foot. And most of the cyclists that I've had that have come to me with like, oh, I heard I have to activate my glutes. That was kind of like the onus for our second, you said one topic to address here. Is like glute recruitment. Like, I don't care about the glutes right now. I care about your feet. Like, let's start there and figure out like what are your strategies for breathing? What are your feet doing? Like, are you just like, are they floppy pancakes, or are you actually interacting with the shoe? Are you able to find that? And then from there, we can get into like, okay, let's look at glute recruitment from there. Cause I found, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's purely empirical, but most people that have like poor glutes, once I get the foot moving a little bit, I have a new drill that I picked up from Joel called coin under third toe lift. So essentially you keep the big toe, you keep the tripod foot, and then you're lifting that transverse arch. I find when people can do like 10 to 15 of those, magically the glutes begin to work, because now we're getting that pressure sensation down through the foot, and that just fires everything else up the chain.
Yeah. Are you familiar with very similar philosophy? Is a guy named Chong Ji. He's out of New York. It's hyper arch fascia training. Something I'm butchering it a bit, but similar concepts in his program. You're picking up the marble and you're doing leg scoops with the toes kind of clenched around the marble or the ball or whatever you're using. And he's got a whole system of that similar technique, and then little bounces on the heel and different things that you progress to, right, to stiffen the ankle and connect that fascia. And, what you're saying makes perfect sense to me, because if we think from the lens of evolutionary biology, which is the only lens through which we can examine, or it's the first lens, I'll say, through which we examine modern movement, because we have to understand how many hundreds of thousands of years of evolution are coded into us. I mean, how do you engage your glutes? Do guys sit around at a fire, cooking their deer, engaging their glutes just so they can stand up properly? No. Like, they just move. And what's the first thing you do when you move? You move your foot on the ground to stand up, or to walk forward, or to run, to hunt that animal. It's the force into the ground that then cues the nervous system to engage the muscles and load share to distribute force properly, to wind up and throw the spear as you're running or leaping off the log or whatever. So this is the problem with cycling. The two fulcrums that cause all these challenges is the saddle and the pedal axle, right? They just screw everything up. And I think that's been confounded by really bad saddle shape, disastrous saddle designs we've had in the past. And some of them are still in the market today. There are some incredibly bad saddles today, but we've come light years ahead of where we were 10 years ago even. So that's good. And then the shoes, the rigid shoes. I've come to the conclusion that the smartest way for someone who's been in the sport for more than 5 years is to spend at least a couple months each winter riding around on flats with these, or Vivo Barefoots, or whatever, or Innovates, and then bring out your race shoes for race day. Because imagine how much stronger you would be if you went and did intervals, just rode your townie up and down steep climbs all the time. You go do the Zook climb or Shine Canyon or whatever on your townie, in squishy shoes, not squishy, but flexible soles, that is, with that allow proper toe splay and don't have a lot of padding. You'd be super strong, right?
I think yes and no, right? I'm shaking my head yes, but it depends on, I think that there's a lot to be said for tissue quality. And I think that's where people don't want to do the work. So like, if you think about when someone's riding on flats, I think someone who's like a listener of your podcast, or someone who's gone through like the Czech Institute or PRI, it makes sense because they're thinking in spirals. Like, how do I interact with this pedal to do it better, right? Mm-hmm. But then when you have the average rider, they're just not, even if they have it, it's like a fad, right? If we were to put this on Instagram, be like, instantly boost your FTP in 4 weeks or less by 20 watts.
Yeah.
Maybe not 20, maybe we'll say 15. I mean, that's a legitimate return on stiffening. If you're doing this 3 days a week and you're taking care of yourself, you can see some nice returns, but it means you're gonna have to do tissue care. You have to do the soft tissue work. It's essentially 10 minutes of work, but 30 minutes of care. And people are like, I just want the one exercise. Like, show me the chick with the nice feet. And actually, that's a whole nother box. I shouldn't.
Right. Yeah. Chick with the nice feet in the bikini. Wait, why did I click on this?
What was this podcast called again?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, you're right. I say that somewhat in jest. Like, I don't really expect people to go out and train for 3 months in barefoot trainers or whatever on flats. However, I do actually coach some of my athletes to ride on flat pedals from time to time. I think some people, especially in particular when people like they don't have a good strength conditioning program or haven't for years, they only ride their bikes and they don't have a townie, so they're never riding on flat pedals, then they can become, that all those will check the box towards becoming less or more deconditioned in the ankle and in the plantar fascia of the foot. And that spins up the likelihood of problems, in my opinion. So sometimes I even did a bike fitter, I did a podcast with a fitter from the UK, Phil Cavell, who wrote a book called, it was something about riding past 50, and it basically asked the question. What was it?
Midlife cyclist.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. Thank you. That's it. And I talked to him, and one of the things I forgot to ask him about in his book that was quite clever is he said there are times where he recommends that an athlete rides on flats for a while, and he calls this cycling paracetamol, which is his way of saying like unplug them from what's screwing them up, right? And correct their movement patterns, get them to engage through the metatarsals, through the balls of the feet. So, I can't say my idea is totally unique. Like it had occurred to me, and I've been riding flats for years, and that's been a good thing. But then Phil's the one who actually said it in his book. I was like, that's quite clever, actually. So here and there, I break it out for the right moment.
Yeah, and the reason I point that out is because I think you and I both know that there's going to be people who don't really follow us, so don't understand the thought process and the mind map, and we're just kind of like throwing ideas.
Sure.
And like, oh, that's a great thing. I'm going to do that.
Sure.
Just like the guy who owns the minivan and you jacked up his seat so he could ride in TT position more. I'm like, dude, that's super dangerous. Like,
Yeah.
very, very eclectic or eccentric rather, not eclectic.
Yeah.
True story. I'm like, dude, that is so dangerous on so many levels. Do not do that. What are you talking about? I was like, dude, I'm an EMT on an ambulance. Please do not do that. That's like a guaranteed to break your neck.
Yeah.
This is the type of stuff I think we've really lost, right? So in my head, I think people began to wake up to the fact that maybe being clipped into these really hard carbon soled shoes is not the best. Was back when maybe 2018, when I don't remember who it was, they talked about taking the cleats and drilling them to the middle of the foot. So you don't have that loss. And I was like,
cleat position.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, for someone who has a major issue that can work, but how about we just tackle the issue of building the tissue strength?
Right.
And I remember a couple of people were like, well, why would I do that when I can just put the cleat in the middle? I was like, that's exactly why. Because instead of making your body better, you're just looking for a cut and what's going to give.
Where,
knees, hips, low back.
Learning the lesson here. Yeah, right. We're not learning the lesson. The body was meant to move with those chains all being active, and we've shut one of them down. So you're just going to cut it off. I mean, to be honest, it's kind of Western medical mentality. Western medical is really good at ectomies and triage. And look, if I have an open fracture of the femur, I'm going to go to the hospital. I'm not going to try to treat it with homeopathics and duct tape. But there are times when that saves lives. But when we're talking about a dysfunction that's created by movement patterns in repetitive sport and a repetitive endurance sport like cycling, especially with so much submaximal load, where you get the opportunity to build these movement engrams that are slightly dysfunctional, and maybe they're only 0.01% dysfunctional, but then, that teases out over time because you do hundreds of thousands of repetitions in a month or even a year. I mean, let's remember that in a 90-minute ride at 90 RPM, that's 8,100 revolutions. That's a lot of reps. So we entrain our movement patterns quite efficiently in cycling. Yeah.
I think a lot of people miss the fact that it becomes an engram, right? So Dr. McGill uses this. I apologize if it's a bit grotesque, especially these days, but an engram is essentially, it lives in your spinal cord. It doesn't live in the brain. So the example he gave, and he also apologized because that's who he is, but there was a story of say again?
Are you going to talk about the cats, the decerebrate cats?
No, I don't like that one. That one's too much. But this is the one where in World War I, where one of the physiologists was in a trench, and it was during a charge, and he poked his head out and saw a guy's head get blown off, and the guy kept running until he fell into a trench, like just running. Saw the head get clear blown off. That's an engram. It just lives in the spinal cord, and once that is set, it goes. And with cyclist, exactly right. And I think a lot of people miss that is, one, that's where bike fit's important, but also that's where strength training year round is, because you have to we're not battling the engrams. We're just trying to give you better options. Because when you do that over and over again, and then you sit in a chair, the body's not, like we talked about at the beginning here of part 2, is like you go into that posterior pelvic tilt. Everybody's talking about anterior pelvic tilt. Well, to a degree, it's normal. Depends on who you are, how things are set up. But for a cyclist, like, you've got to work on giving the nervous system options, right? Until it causes pain or true dysfunction, which we can't say unless you're a physical therapist or a surgeon, like specifically for that body part, might I add. My elbow surgeon told me I have a back pain problem because of my movement. Sure. Yes.
Wrong zip code.
It really is one of those things where we just want to give the body options and try and figure out what's the best way for you right now. Because that'll change over the life cycle of a rider, right? I mean, how you train somebody at 23 when they're trying to break into the Euro Pro is going to be different because you give more, right? You're able to say, okay, we're going to let that option kind of fade a little bit. We want to keep you healthy. So during your off season, whatever that is, we're going to train the opposite, but we'll let those tissues go that way. But you pay that price, and most recreational cyclists don't even think of that. They're like, oh, I just want to be more aero. I just want, 10 more watts. It's like, well, what price are you willing to pay in 5 years? They're like, I don't care. Like, I just make me fast.
Yeah. That's just youth though. I mean, that's what being an adult is, and growing up as a man is, or a woman, an adult is, you learn to think ahead further than your dinner plate, or, the next Netflix show you want to binge on until 3 a.m. And then you wake up the next day and go, oh, wow, work is really hard today. I shouldn't have done that. And you do that 1,000 times, and then maybe you learn the lesson. Right. So as coaches and people who offer paths to optimize people's health, all we can do, I think, sometimes is highlight that path and say, look, this is what I see happening. The choice is yours. But if you want to keep, shortcutting yourself by making these quick and dirty choices, I'm not a soothsayer. Like, I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, I do actually, but when I look into it, I see probability, not actuality. And the probability is that this is going to cause you challenge over time. I could be wrong. You can surf this for the next 30 years. We all know the grandma who lived to be 94 and smoked a pack a day, or the grandpa who drank a bottle of Jim Beam, 5 times a week for 50 years or whatever, and somehow didn't die of his liver didn't fall out. Do we have an explanation for that? No. Does it justify everyone else drinking that much Jim Beam? Definitely not. So let's be reasonable about this. But yeah.
I think adults are horrible at that, though. Like, look at how many people don't save for retirement, right? Something like less than 20% actually save for retirement. And we're not talking about the one where, like, the company's like, we have to put 5% because that's the law.
A minimum. Yeah. Right.
Like, I think we're horrible at that. And part of that is our society of instant gratification, right? I can get what I want right now. Go to Instagram and find the exercise that looks hard, versus like actually riding flat for 3 months and thinking about how you're pedaling some days, and other days just trying to get it to feel easy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. 100%. So, when we think, like, Paul would talk about this being sort of the archetype of the child and how we progress in that 4-quadrant, he calls it a 4-quadrant progression or spirit path of growth in life, right? And if you look at Steiner's teachings, he would argue that there's one chakra every 7 years. But in Paul's model, there, you start out as a child, you're dependent on others, then you graduate or progress. We'll say grow. You don't graduate, you grow to the warrior phase. And that's where a lot of athletes are. The warrior is all about exactly what it sounds like. You go out and, kill the beast and bring it home, and, bring home the trophy, and you're the champion, and then you get the girl and you get the house and you get accolades, right? And then if you really master your craft as a warrior, become a king or queen. You would evolve to a king or queen. And notably, each of these phases contains, you don't leave the other phase behind you. It's contained within it, right? It's like a sphere of growth. And each of these phases of growth has a shadow side and, we'll say, a light side, right? There's ways to be a warrior and kind of do it in a way that spirals you down and isn't growth oriented. And there are ways to be warriors in the right way, step into your presence as a warrior, and then grow into the next phase, which is king or queen. That's where you own your empire. You're a master of your craft, right? And you often have people working for you as a king or queen, right? You have an empire you have to manage, and then that can become burdensome. Sometimes the empire grows too big and people steal from you, or they swindle you, or, your employees kick you out of the corporation and take over your business, or whatever. The board fires you. There's that kind of thing. And then the last phase would be wise man or wise woman, where you still can practice the craft and it so well you could do it, while singing the Constitution backwards or drunk, that kind of mastery. But you really have no need to prove anything. You put down the sword. You can take it out if you need to, but you put it down, and you share your wisdom. You teach. That would be wise man or wise woman when you embrace that phase. Anyway, just a little off topic, but archetypally, I think we can probably all identify with where we are on this journey and where our clients are. And sometimes I like to show my clients that roadmap just to let them know, look, this is kind of the map of our progression that's potential here. And often I meet adults who are firmly in the childhood archetype still. They have not left that archetype. They're dependent on others. They're in codependent relationships. They can't manage their spending. They can't save for their future. They can't take responsibility for their diet, their exercise program. They're eating the Cheetos all the time. They're drinking all the time. They're drinking 7 cups of coffee a day, et cetera, and they don't want to take responsibility for their back pain or their whatever pain they've got going on. And they can't see the connection between the choices they're making and the result they've gotten, right? or if they do, they think there's going to be a simple solution, which is, a new magic Advil or a new magic painkiller or, peptide, right? I'll just take BPC 157 or whatever it is, right? And that'll solve, I'll just get in it, go get PRP and it'll fix my knee. And then I can go smash watts and do the group ride for the next 20 years. That's a childlike mentality, right? It's dependence upon others instead of taking authority over the decisions you've made that have resulted in this consequence. You're looking for external validation or external assistance to solve your problems. So
I think you touched on three important things that as a community we need to get better at. One is shaking out, and this has bothered me from day one. Just because you were a highly accomplished in your sport athlete does not mean that you're a good coach, right? Because a number of them just teach exactly what they did, and if someone doesn't fit, they're like, "Oh, you failed the system," right? So getting
100%.
getting some, and that's where I'm actually excited. I had to reschedule with her because she actually had jury duty, or got called to jury duty. But the new coaching education coordinator for USA Cycling, Susie, they're redoing it. It's very education oriented, not necessarily CEUs, as a lot of people thought, including myself, thought like, dude, 15 CEUs is like $1,000 a year to do. Like, it's more on like, we want teachers and people who are willing to share their wisdom and not building these little silos and being precious mine. Right? We have that so often, and how does the bike fitting work? Oh, it's a proprietary system. Like, dude, come on. Like, what are you looking at? Just tell. So I think that's a second thing of teachers and wisdom and moving through and building that empire. It really is through the act of giving and sharing and realizing you don't have all the answers. I mean, those are always the best rulers, are those who make a decisive decision, but they're also willing to say, I don't know. Let's find somebody who knows about this, right? I just sent a gift to one of my clients out of the UK. Well, now he moved to Spain, but congratulations, John, finally getting the okay for that. But essentially, it was the Monty Python where if he wants to cast the bid, he needs to answer these 3 questions, and the questions change. And then the first guy gets thrown off, like the second guy gets thrown off, and the third one he says, "What is it? The African swallow, or is it?" I don't know. Like, Lur, how did you know this? Well, sometimes as a king, you need to know these things. Right? Hilarious.
You're gonna laugh, but my wife and I literally watched that movie last night.
Oh, that's crazy. That's crazy,
that's
dude.
And I hadn't seen it in a decade. It just happened to be on, so we just sat down and watched it for 20 minutes, and we saw that exact scene.
But that's what we need. Is we need like somebody to be a gatekeeper and throw these people. You just have to do this. Like, dude, it's so complex. And I think that's really like the crux of everything that you've shared and what we've talked about here is like, there's so many considerations as to what the solution could be. And that's where your assessment being so thorough, you're actually riding with them. They have a very long questionnaire, not just about their biking, and I love the fact you put like, what are your goals? What would success look like? And they're like, well, in life or in cycling? So you're really learning about the psyche as well. Like, are they compartmentalizing? Are they fully focused? And just getting that deeper connection. There was a third thing I didn't write down. I think it had to do with the child. And I think part of that is a lot of the coaching these days is we're creating more children. We're not creating people who actually have answers. Like sometimes, and I do this is part of a small part of having a coach. Days like today, I don't really feel like getting on the bike and riding. Well, I've got the 30/30s and I got the tempo. And if I don't turn it green, then he's going to know. Okay, fine. Right. So that's part of it. But the other part is the interaction of, hey, how should I modify this today? Because this is happening. We have snowflakes where we're making people too sensitive and not able to decide because we're like, oh, but maybe you'll get hurt. And the other side we have where they're just going on autopilot, like the AI will tell me, like, sure, maybe. How do we as cyclists, or how do you think we as cyclists should look at this? Like, where's the happy medium of like using AI or using a coach? Like, what questions should we as riders or coaches be asking? Like, what would the 3 or 4 core questions of finding the right bike fit or saddle be?
Right. That's I feel like that's a few questions in one. I'll do my best.
Yeah, sorry. I was
That's okay. That's okay.
running with it.
All relevant stuff. All relevant stuff. I mean, AI is, exploding right now, and there are people who are fully on the bandwagon, and then there's me. I'm a little more on the Terminator side of things. You can call me a curmudgeon if you're so inclined. I probably deserve that title to some degree. Although I was the third guy in the United States to have an SRM in '95, so there's an embracement of technology. So both sides, right? I don't shy away from the use of technology, but I think that people get enamored with the bling and the shiny lights, and they get excited about it, and they love gizmos and devices. And some of it is that new paracetamol mentality, right? Like, oh, if I have an app, it'll teach me how to meditate. It can guide you on how to meditate, but you're not going to learn how to meditate from an app. It can be a tool that you use to help you. So that's one of my parameters for technology is, does it teach me something I didn't already know about myself, right? It's got to be really easy to use. It's got to be accurate. And it's got to teach me something I don't know about myself. Those are my three litmuses for technology, whether I'll embrace technology. Bottom before that, it's got to be useful too. I'm not going to buy a left-handed monkey wrench, even if it's digital. But this is technology, and it's useful right now because it's recording me, so I use it. But sorry, clunk. But as far as AI goes, I see it polarizing coaching. This is my crystal ball, attempting to use my own prognostications about what will happen in the future, or predictions. I think that it's going to polarize coaching. I think they're going to be really pretty good AI training programs that are cut and paste generic within the parameters of AI. You'll enter in this and you'll enter in that, and it'll be somewhat adaptive to what you're doing. And it will predict how you're going to get better on some sort of curve, which means that if you did 3 sets of 8 by 30 last week and they went really well, it might give you 9 reps instead of 8 or something like that. And to be honest, any nutless monkey could do that, but AI will do it for us instead, and we'll pay $35.95 a month for it or whatever. I don't know how much that stuff is, maybe $100 a month. And I'm underselling it a bit. There'll be some more features to it than that, but it'll be a program that's obviously not very interactive and not very, it's missing the human element, right? If you want to get on the phone and call your coach and say, hey man, I really didn't sleep well last night because my wife and I got in a fight and I just couldn't sleep, or this is bothering me, or I have this challenge at work and I'm not sure how I feel about my training today. And they want you to sit there and listen to them and understand them and have a connection with them and have your finger on the pulse of what's happening in their life. That will become more one-on-one coaching. So that's where the polarity is going to happen. The people want that kind of care and relationship with their coach. That will become more exclusive, and coaching on that level, the pricing will go up, and there'll be fewer people doing that and few people who want that, but it will be a richer environment financially. Unfortunately, that means it'll probably become somewhat exclusive based on funding to some degree. And then the other side of it will be the AI, which will be just a more advanced cut and paste. It'll be a more advanced trainer road or whatever generic stuff people are slapping in calendars these days, cutting and pasting in calendars these days. And to be fair, there are quite a few coaches who are actually doing that and charging the one-on-one. And that's a slippery slope for all coaches. You have to hold yourself to a very high standard and be engaged with your clients. And that's not easy work. I know I've been doing it for 25 years. It requires a lot of management of your time and energy and genuine interest and passion for the sport. But so I think that's what I see happening. And so really it comes down to, if a client wants to go one way or the other, they have to figure out what they want from the relationship with, what is their relationship with sport? Is it something that they're relatively happy with having be managed by AI, and they just kind of need to be told what to do, not necessarily in a command perspective or from a command perspective, but from the perspective of, well, I just need creative ideas and I need the program to have flow and make sense, but I can figure out all the rest of that stuff. AI is probably going to be more appropriate for someone who's not necessarily a true warrior in the sense that they have to know really what they can produce. They're not really digging on a soul level to find out what they can really do on the bike. An AI program probably won't really tease that out of them, right? That's a human interaction. That's soul to soul. But for somebody who just wants to be told what to do and have a pretty good program, AI will probably tick the box. But if you want anything beyond that, or if you have a really complex schedule, or you have a very complex relationship with the sport and you can't iron it out, you have a lot of depth to your passion with cycling, and you're trying to figure out what nuance it goes in and what races work for you, or you're one of those guys who still really wants to race road, but you miss the memo that road is dead. That's a good example of how do we craft this passion in a way and find a way to express it still in the sport of cycling when there are pretty much no road races anymore. That's one example of how that outcome could play out. So I see it polarizing things.
Today's reading from the Tao. The Tao is infinite, eternal. Why is it eternal? It was never born, thus it can never die. Why is it infinite? It has no desires for itself, thus it is present for all beings. The master strays behind. That is why she is ahead. She is detached from all things. That is why she is one with them. Because she has let go of herself, she is perfectly fulfilled.
I think there was a second part to that question that I didn't get there.
There was, but that was me being a poor interviewer because I just had like notes. I'm like, oh, and this, and then tie it together. Oops. Yeah, here's a question, Colby. Answer.
I just do my best.
No, that was really good. I think that I agree with you. That's kind of my summation of it also, is we're going to see, to put it bluntly and non-PC, we're going to see the crappy coaches who are doing exactly that. And I have seen that. People show me their training peaks and I'm like, dude, I bought this training plan in like 2007 for like $19 and you're paying how much? Exact same verbiage, like everything. Just,
yeah.
I know Training Peaks is taking that seriously and they're really locking down on that. But that's exactly right. And I love the fact you got into like, are you using sport to learn something about yourself, like to unlock, or is it more like you enjoy it? And that's, I think, the conversation that we're not having that we need to is, what do you want to get out of sport? Like, are you looking to be the best you can because of fitness, because someone in your family's sick, because that's your psychological outlet to deal with things, because you just want to learn about yourself and what you're actually capable of? Like, what do you want out of it? Is it just a goal? And I totally underestimated that when I started, right? I kind of picked up on it subtly, so I learned it in the first month of my interactions with my clients, but only the last 4 or 5 years did 5 years, 2019, before Corona, was it actually a question. It was like, what do you want to get out of sport? And people are like, well, I want to win my race. Like, okay, what else? No, I want to win the race. Okay, cool. That's what we'll do. And then those are the clients where it's like, okay, we don't need to necessarily teach life lessons, but we need to teach long-term, don't destroy your body for this one thing because you're only 42 and hopefully you'll have many more years. Like, the number of triathlon tattoos that you see on people on their calf in the checkout aisle, and you're like, wow, so you destroyed your body first, or that happened in the training process, right? And I get it. Like, some people, that's their thing. Like, look what I did because people told me I couldn't. Like, dude, totally cool. No problem with that.
Yeah, it's like the Unbound 200-mile race. You have 100 people maybe actually racing it, and then you've got 1,900 that are just there to complete it. And that's okay, but I have to ask the question, like, okay, if your longest bike ride for the last year has been 4 hours, what business do you have doing a race that's going to take you 4 times that on race day? And maybe the answer is, I just want to see if I can survive it. And that's my thing. But you could do permanent damage to your body with that much load. It just, I struggle with it. I really struggle with it. I'm also coming at it from my lens, right? Which is, I was a pro bike racer for 15 years. So when I sign up for a bike race and pin on a number, like, I'm trying to win it. Even today, that's why I've entered less races, right? I race 3-4 times a year tops because I've mostly laid down the sword. But when I do it, I get right back into that old pattern and all the old habits come to life. I mean, I've been racing my bike for 35 years. So everything just turns on and it's the way it goes. So I don't have, I would have to do something like a 50K trail run for me to get into that survivalist mindset and out of the racing mindset. So part of it is probably my bias, and I don't hold judgment against people who do this. I just question Are you destroying are you going to are you going to wreck your knee in one 200-mile bike race? Because I think that's definitely possible. And for sure, it's something that's happened. Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm right there with you. And that's my biggest fear. And I really tried to get out ahead of it with the strength training, because I'm like, man, there's going to be a lot of coaches that are going to say, hey, I can charge an extra $200 a month for giving strength training. No problem, man. I'll take a weekend course and go for it. And it's like, dude, you can like overtraining on your bike is really hard to do. You've got to be a real skullhead to do that, a knucklehead. And I did it. I actually properly overtrained myself, didn't look at the bike for 6 months, didn't do any type of anything except for some light strength training, because I really ran myself into the wall. And people are like, you're an idiot, right? I'm like, no, I'm not. I am. Yeah, I've done stupid 17 colors in my life, including trying to catch an 8-kilo kettlebell on a kettlebell swing with an outstretched arm. Like in the moment, like, what the are you doing? And then oh, too late. There we go. Like, guys, don't do this. But the point is that I think it's not just in your mentality. It's also a lens of like, you've been bike racing for 35 plus years. You've enjoyed it. You've gone through crashes and accidents and all this stuff, but it's like, okay, I'm going to push hard enough, but I'm not going to be so reckless as to, it's going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Starts with an M. It's going to malign my body. Malign? No. It's going to destroy my body until, I have a cane, I don't want to be 50 in a cane.
Right.
But that comes back to the other question, that is like, what would be 2 or 3 questions in your mind map? I mean, Colby's head, like for the folks out there, what should we like wrap our heads around and be like, these are the 3 questions I should ask myself to kind of guide to get the most I want out of the sport?
Okay. Well, what is your dream goal or objective? That has to be the first thing, right? That's the North Star that guides everything. And I think one point, there are a lot of directions that could go, but just to illustrate why that's important, imagine someone whose father tells them, you are going to be a lawyer. You have to be a lawyer. And their father tells them this, programs this belief into them throughout their childhood. And then this woman goes to college, and I'm just imagining a hypothetical thought experiment. This woman goes to college and she goes to pre-law, and then she becomes a lawyer, and then wakes up at the age of 38 one day and realizes that she has pursued a career that she can't stand for 20 years or whatever. And that's a real crisis, and it's a real thing that happens. So the point I'm making is we have to understand that if we're doing something that's hard and we're really committing ourselves to something, whether it's bike racing or a profession, we have to make sure that dream is ours and not someone else's. If you're enacting someone else's dream, it's going to tear you in half, right? And cycling, especially bike racing, is way too hard to do it on someone else's drive. You have to have your own intrinsic drive to really express yourself in that sport. Sometimes people tell them, yes, this is the real thing. It's authentic. I love cycling. I've always loved cycling. Bike racing's my thing. And we all fell in love with the bike. I mean, I fell in love with the bike years ago. When I was 15 years old, 14 years old, I fell in love with cycling. It felt like I got struck by lightning. To quote Mike Creed, he said, the OG of podcasters, Mike Creed. Thank you, Michael. He said, I didn't choose cycling. Cycling chose me. That's exactly how I felt. So sometimes people have that belief, but then we have to ask the question, are you addicted? And we could define an addiction as any repeated behavior that does not give you the desired result. So, okay, let's break that down a little more. I think the danger zone comes when endurance athletes are either using their sport to run from something in their lives that they don't really want to deal with, ride from, or they grew up in a household where love was conditional, or they were dealing with abandonment, right? And what they're doing in their athletic life is they're attempting to prove to themselves and others that they are worthy of love because they can endure pain and suffering, or they're not even that far in it. They're not getting to the worthy of love part. That's buried way down deep. We're not even going to address that because feelings are yucky. They're really more concerned with, can I just endure because this is my practice? The hardest points in my life and the most unloved I felt in my life were when I was as a child in my home. I didn't feel loved or warmth or unconditional love. I felt abandonment. I felt coldness. I felt like there was no one there and I was on my own. So now I'm just rehashing that old program in my adult life. And I see sport as preparation for when that comes again. Well, if you spend your life preparing for something, it will come. So I would ask the question, the next question would be, how are you manifesting that in your life? Are you manifesting it in the job that you really don't have any passion for and your coworkers don't have passion for, and you found yourself in this dead profession and you're enduring the cold there, so to speak, or enduring the pain there? Or are you manifesting that in your relationship with your spouse? Are you really not present? Are you manifesting it in your relationship with your children? Or maybe it's your parents, maybe it's your siblings. Where in your life are you manifesting that? So that's two starting points. What is your dream goal or objective? Authentically look at that, write it down. That's a great way to do it. Say it out loud is another good way to do it. Because sometimes we're like, okay, I'm going to do this. This is a good idea. This is a good exercise. And then you start thinking about it on a bike ride. And then an hour and a half later, you're like, oh, I don't know. I ended up doing these threshold intervals. And that's fine. But if you want to get somewhere, you gotta put it in the universe, in the physical universe. So, you either got to say it out loud or maybe say it into a recording device and then play it back to yourself later. That's a great way to do it. And then listen, play it back with a trusted friend or a spouse. Maybe that's another way to do it. Write it down, then come back and read it later. These are all ways to get it out. And then, we're trying to get at, are you playing out someone's program or are you playing your own program? And we want to do everything consciously. If we're doing things consciously, then there's a chance to do them authentically and really learn something, whatever that may be. Right? I mean, you talked about that 8 kilogram kettlebell you held out and you injured yourself. You did it authentically. You learned something from it. Now you can offer that gold to your students. So from that experience, it was definitely worthwhile, right? Even though it probably wasn't pleasant at the time. And I've had a million of those too. So sorry, weeds there. But then the second point was about us really asking, what is the nature of our experience during the sport? I guess that's how I would encapsulate that question. Meaning, what emotion are we feeling when we're riding hard? Are we running from something? Is there something in our past we can't deal with? Is it something in our present we can't deal with or don't want to deal with? Are we medicating our lives with our cycling? Are we exorcising our demons? And again, there's no judgment for me on it. Like, there are a lot of people who will willingly, openly admit that they use their cycling as their therapy. That's okay. There are a lot worse. You can use heroin for therapy. You can use alcohol to medicate your problems. You can use cycling. If we have those three choices, I'll have more people do cycling. However, there's a couple problems with that. One is feelings buried alive never die. So we have to kind of recognize that you can only therapy something so much with exercise, right? You're going to have to deal with it at some point. And also, cycling is such an addictive sport that people become so addicted to it that eventually anything you become addicted to, the universe will take away from you. So you keep riding your bike and doing threshold, you're going to have some challenge. So the universe will at some point go, oh, you like this too much. Pluck. And it will just give you a knee injury or give you a heart condition or give you some sort of catastrophic illness that keeps you off the bike for 8 weeks or give you something else that's yucky that will prevent you from riding. And then if you're really addicted, you're in a world of pain because you don't have your addiction and you didn't cross-pollinate with the ability to self-soothe, which is about being an adult. That is taking autonomy and having autonomy over and command over an agency over this environment, this internal environment, and saying, I don't have to ride a bike today to be happy or deal with my wife or deal with my children, my husband, whatever, my aging father that we can't figure out if we're putting him in a home and he still keeps driving every day and I don't know what to do with him. I can sit down and do breath work. I can sit and do meditation. I can go for a hike. I can go do movement. I can do primal movement or lift heavy things. I can find a way to have a relationship with myself in a way that serves the need to be by myself and cultivate energy without having to be reliant on this two-wheeled beast, right? So I think that was only 2, but I feel like those are pretty good ones.
They're deep, man. I think you touched on a lot of underlying rifts that I think a lot of people, especially looking at the pros, don't realize. You just tagged about 12 riders I've interacted with in the last 9 months. I'm like, there's something there. Like,
Yep.
that's demons chasing him, making him turn the pedals. That ain't drive. People are like, oh yeah, he's really motivated. I'm like, no, there's something different there. That's a very
usually that's the case. Most people who are really driven to, own 7 companies or win a bunch of Tour de France's or whatever, honestly, not always, but most of the time, there's trauma that's being worked out there. There's tension. There's friction in that human. Why else would you go smash yourself to oblivion up the side of a mountain? If you're perfectly happy and content and you've got, 2 cats and 2 dogs and a wife and a picket fence and no trauma, you don't go ride your bike as hard as you can up Cheyenne Canyon 5 times in a row. It's just not a thing.
Yeah.
And again, no judgment. This is the pro bike racer talking here. So I have my own stuff. Yeah.
And I think we've all gone through, and that's part of the beauty of the sport that I've realized. Like, I was forced off after a hip injury, low back injury. I mean, I can name it. And it's just like, I've fallen in love with it again, but it's more of, people are like, oh yeah, I'm going to go do threshold VO2. I'm like, cool, bro. I'd rather do that on a Versa climber in a gym where I can collapse on the floor safely than on a bike where I'm like, oh, there's cars or there's huge pit that I got to go through with the gravel. Like, yep. Cool. I love riding the bike. And I think that's one of the beauties of going through it and having the ebb and flow of having been down those paths of like, there's a season and a reason, right? And it all comes down to wherever we are, if we're pedaling the bike that hard or we're pedaling the bike period, there's something that we're enjoying. It's a connection and an expression of self in a way. But in order for us to enjoy that for many years to come, or to be able to move on to something else, like, we have to take care of the physical body and we have to take care of the mental aspect. And I love that you picked up on that on the 3 questions, right? Because many people are like, drink water, sleep, and make sure you are recovering actively, right?
Which are important things.
They are, sure. But it's not the whole self, right? Colby's down about a liter for those who are listening.
I did do a strength. I was going to tell you this. I did a strength workout right before we got on. I even left my stuff out. And I was going to ask, have you ever used these BFR bands?
The blood flow restriction? So
yeah.
Not those in particular.
Okay. These are pneumatic, as you can tell. You use a blood pressure cuff to pump them up. And I've been playing with these for a while. I used the kind of cheaper Amazon ones at first. And then I went with these B3s and I'm pretty impressed, man. I really like them. For what it's worth. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have a minute, if you're still good to keep going for a minute.
So I have mixed feelings about blood flow restriction. So I think it works, right? It's purely mechanical, or physiological rather. So it's one of the 3 main triggers we can do to increase muscle strength or adaptation in that area. The challenge becomes it can only be an appendix. It can't be, you can't like use a blood pressure cuff for your core, right? I mean, you can, right. You can use a weightlifting belt, but that doesn't count. I'm a really big fan. I learned from this guy, Alon Kirshner, many years ago. I just went to watch him for a couple hours, and he worked in cardiac rehab, and he had weights. And I was like, oh, that's like a lawsuit waiting to happen. And I said that to him. I'm like, this is like not good. He's like, no, you've got to be able to understand the body. Everyone who comes in here is lifting extremely slow. We're talking like 15 to 20 seconds per part of the contraction. So eccentric and concentric, very slow. So there's no big spike that's out of control. So I think blood flow is similar to that, where blood flow restriction is similar to that, where it can be very useful in points. It's fun to play with, right? I think that's massive. But to use it as a regular, because if you think about the body as a whole, you're throwing so much, it's almost like eliciting a injury response to an appendage. And it's like, what's going to be the long-term negative effect of this, right? You also have the compression as well of the actual artery. So some people will pump it up way too hard.
Yeah, of course. Right.
But I do think like as you're getting up, if you're really stuck, you're having issues, you have a discrepancy that needs to be addressed, those types of things that can be really useful in, because it really allows you to kind of even the playing field rather than just do another set on the right side, right? So you can do the same amount of set and reps. You just increase the physiological stress. That's like how deep do you want me to go? Like is that kind of where you're playing right now?
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, so one of the the guy who made these bands, he has quite a bit of educational content. One of the things he talks about is not just the mechanical restriction, but also the hormonal consequences. So he talks about, how we get, we can endogenously create more nitrous oxide to help increase blood flow, right? And so you get this charge and release effect. And that's real beneficial. And then with that comes positive hormonal consequences. So his perspective is that one of the big advantages of the blood flow is that you get just as much stimulus for change, but with a lot less muscle damage, because you don't need to or can't lift as much. So you're not moving as much weight, but because of the restriction, you get equally good benefits. So I think, you must know John Tarkenton. He used to work at USAC,
Yeah.
coaching previously. He used to work a lot with Moxie, which was they used that near infrared technology to measure muscle blood flow, right? And he would talk about how one of the adaptations to cycling, in particular for people who don't climb a lot and then they get thrown into Troy the Healer or whatever, a race with a bunch of gradient, is that you get this momentary ischemia in the muscle, right? This fractionary ischemia. So to break that down, because those are kind of high syllable words, what we're talking about is when you push really hard with the muscle, it doesn't matter if you're on the gym or on the bike, you push hard enough, right? The muscle fibers contract so hard that there's this secondary or fractions of a second prevention of capillary blood flow. And this is problematic for muscles because, of course, blood flow is delivering oxygen and taking away the waste products, the CO2 and whatever else we got going on there, fragments of muscle tissue if you're crossfitting yourself to death, perhaps. And so you get this contraction that prevents blood flow, and there's an adaptation that happens there. It's like you're strangling the muscle. And on the bike, this probably doesn't really happen if you're riding at 90 RPM on the flats, even if you're riding pretty hard. Maybe it does if you're in a really low position. You might get some ischemia at the hip, maybe at the acute fibers, right? The proximal fibers of rect fem, for example, I would imagine. But then you go up a really steep climb, especially at sea level where you're making a lot of force because you've got a lot of fuel in the fuel line, we'll say, a lot of octane-rich fuel. And so you start to contract the muscles really hard on a steep, short climb, and you get this fractionary ischemia that happens. So the muscle then is like starving. And there's some riders who are better at this adaptation. And I talked about this in the first podcast than others. I think that I'm one of the riders who really has to train that to get good at it. And I think that's because I have inherently very low muscle and fascial tone. So I'm not as good at resisting that ischemia because my muscle fibers are so loose that they just collapse under the load of their own pressure. And then I lack a lot of blood flow. And so I think this, from what I can tell, this sort of zeroes in on that weakness for me and helps my system adapt to it. That's maybe just incidental to me, but I think that there's something to this. I also have a theory that part of the reason everyone's moving to short cranks right now is because under long cranks, we induce more fractionary ischemia in the muscle, and everybody's focused on hip angle, and that's fine. Hip angle is part of that equation, but I think we get fractionary ischemia all across more muscle tissue than people are giving credit for. And when I first switched to short cranks, that was what I internally sensed. I was like, oh, my leg, when I get to the top of a steep grade with the shorter cranks, my muscles are less loaded. So then it's not that I go any faster on the steep grade. I go about the same speed that I did with the longer cranks, but as soon as the grade eases, I can immediately increase speed, whereas before I'd be a little gassed and be stuck, flooded with lactate. So one more thing. So he talks about basically this trains you to have really high global lactate, right? His whole discussion is that it takes you to a very high lactate level very quickly because the system just can't process the lactate the same way, right? With the reduced blood flow, you can't transport the lactate across the cell membrane and use it aerobically that you're creating during your glycolytic efforts. So when he puts these on, he cranks them up pretty high, and he'll recommend you do 8 minutes tops, and you're just continuously moving, right? And I have adapted this to do my own methods where I kind of ramp everything up. So I do this, and I kind of use like primal movement. I'm on the ground. I'm doing crawling. I'm using dumbbells. I'm using the stability ball, and I'm also breathing nasally only. So mouth closed for the entire session. So that just kind of ramps up the pressure internally. So you get this really high lactate level. You just hold it there for all 8 minutes. And you might replicate the hardest 8 minutes of a 4-hour ride where your lactate is super high I don't know what I've not ever bothered to take lactate numbers to test it, but the point is, it's kind of like distilling your workout to the hardest 8 minutes. That's his idea.
Yeah. So I have two concerns with it, right? So
Yeah.
one, the body's incredibly pliable and it can adapt to these things. But remember, hormones are the strongest drugs known to man, right? So if we're affecting a hormonal change in the body, what's the trickle down effect? What's that going to be? Like, to me, it goes immediately to two things. One is gene expression. What are we changing in your actual genetic level? And that might be a little bit extreme for some people out there, especially some of the specific exercise physiologists that come to mind that I've spoken to the last couple of years. But we know that enough environmental stress can change gene expression. You need enough exposure to it, but you're triggering real changes. So that's number one.
Yes.
Number two is we can get a very similar effect. Like, this is where the side plank endurance style that I learned, it's actually a Russian pyramid style from Dr. McGill. This is what so many people get wrong about it, is you're not just holding yourself up for those 7 to 10 seconds. It is a maximal contraction. You are creating an ischemic environment. And then when you come down, you're practicing movement patterns under fatigue, and you're actually allowing a partial relaxation, what you were talking about, where it's a chance for the blood flow to come in, remove some of the byproducts, and you're coming right back up again. You can do the same thing for like a seated leg extension. For you can't, you'd need the not the dynamometer, the isotonic machine. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. So
in that instance, I think the blood flow restriction can be really useful, but nobody's going to subjugate themselves to doing the isotonic movements over and over again. Like, you've got to come and do 3-4 weeks, and you have to get those regular exposures. So I think that it can be useful in a pinch for injuries 100%. I think that's one of the best things we can do, because the hormonal status of the body's already off. If you think about it in that, the body's kicking into recovery, and you're giving it a similar burst from like the performance side, the actual normal stress, but with less actual physiological energy. So you have more available for the tissue repair and adaptation. I'm all for that. I think that can be really useful. But I get really, my antennas go up like, I don't know if I'd really want to use this for more than 3 or 4 weeks at a time, and maybe not more than 2 cycles out of a training year. Because what are we doing to the internal environment? Like, how is that going to affect things? That cascade effect can be a real bitch.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, for me, I just see it as a stressor. It's just a stress, just like it's distilling a normal weight session, a 45-minute weight session, into 8 minutes. That's how I'm conceptualizing it, but maybe I'm missing some basic points there that are more, I mean, the signal's a bit different, but, well, I don't know if it is.
I don't think it is. I think it's just a flood. What you're doing is you're taking a floodlight instead of a flashlight.
Yeah. So I think that's okay, right? I mean, you're just compressing things into a shorter time frame and kind of getting to the to use a pretty crude term, the money shot of the film, right? Instead of 45 minutes, we're just taking 8 minutes, and we're just getting the best parts, and that's it. It's straight to the bottom line. One of the advantages is it's like a gym in a bag. Like, you can take it to a hotel where you know that the hotel gym is going to be crap. Or you're traveling, you have no access to any gym at all. You just have a room, and you can do 8 minutes of BFR or 12 minutes of BFR on the floor, and all you need is body weight. You can mess yourself up pretty good. So from that perspective, but I would say, Mike recommends, the guy who makes these bands, he does recommend a rotation of BFR and traditional strength in a complete program. I haven't heard him mention cycling it on or off, although, to be honest, I think that's wise with just about anything. Like you said, there's a season. What'd you say? There's a season and a time, something like that.
Season and reason.
Season and reason. Thank you. Like, yeah, I mean, I definitely believe in the seasonality of everything. I think that people who don't really acknowledge that or live in that awareness are fooling themselves. We're all subject to circadian rhythms and annual rhythms and all the rhythms, monthly rhythms as well, both men and women. So if you're clueless about this, then you're kind of just not paying attention to nature, in my opinion. Yeah. So
I don't know if it was actually around then, but Science of Sport Training with Thomas Kurz.
Okay.
Or by Thomas Kurz.
Yeah.
Dude, it's freaking phenomenal. You want all the classic Eastern European training approach breakdown.
Yeah.
This was given to me by my first mentor, Tim Belts, and it set me off on a fantastic trajectory for my entire career because it really put me ahead. A lot of the stuff that we're exploring now in research that's like cutting edge, it's already in here from like 1940s and 50s. I don't think there's blood flow restriction, but they do talk about like stressors and relaxers. So strength training, here it is, developing explosive strength and ability. They go through concentric, eccentric, tendo unit, strength endurance. I think part of what PFR is trying to do is just trigger more the physiological side. I think in a pinch, as you're describing, it could be useful.
Mm.
I don't know, man. I'm still not that sold on it. The owner for the gym that I use here, he was really big into it for like 3 months, and he's kind of fallen off. Like he'll use it exactly. I don't have a lot of time, so I want to get a good workout and keep the stress up. So I think that's useful, but I'm a bit wary for that because it just I don't think it's as simple as condensing a 45 or 60-minute workout into 8 minutes. I think that there's more going on there.
Well,
I don't know, man.
Maybe we come back to it. I actually have to boogie. I got to go meet my wife.
All good. Yeah. Okay, I got you also.
But we could keep going for a while. We didn't even get into glutes or anything, but
we did. We talked about the pelvis. That works. We talked about the plantar fascia.
Yeah.
Well, let's do this, man. We'll see if we can set up like a quarterly, because this is really interesting. I learned a lot listening as well, and I hope same for you. But yeah, this has been fun, dude.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess we'll sign off, and hopefully we'll have another one. Thanks for the opportunity to come on.
Absolutely, man. Right. Sign off. Where can the folks find you?
Oh yeah. ColbyPierce.com. We talked about that in the first episode too. And then I have my channel, Cycling in Alignment. This will be released on that channel as well. And like I mentioned, I've got good episodes with Helen Hall as one example, and some really brilliant strength and conditioning coaches. And I also got to do an episode with Dr. Courtney Conley recently. She's a foot specialist in Denver rather. And that was a great episode as well. So some of your listeners might get some gold from some of those episodes as well. And hopefully that's the case. But in any case, great to speak with you, and good to discuss all the things and blood flow and whatnot. Maybe we can get together again and compare notes and see what we both learned in the meantime.
I think that would be awesome, man. All right, we'll let you go here. I will sign off. Guys, thank you so much for listening to our random adventures down the rabbit holes.
Attention, well dippers. Did you know that I offer a unique service at my studio in Boulder, Colorado? An integrative fitting is the culmination of my experience and understanding that helps an athlete have a deeper insight into their relationship to cycling and movement. This is understood in the context of how the dream, goal, or objective aligns the client's choices and habits. The psyche, the environment, and drive will all influence the current expression of athletic ability. As we understand these factors, we can shape and direct athletic potential. What this means in a practical sense is that we spend about 6 hours working together, including a short or outdoor ride. We will film you on and off the bike, and we will discuss an extensive intake questionnaire. You will leave the fitting with a unique perspective on your function and with actionable pathways to improve your performance. This service was created specifically to help cyclists who have been through various fitting sessions and have had unsuccessful or unsatisfactory results. We dig deeper to find more meaningful outcomes. If you are interested in knowing more about an integrative fitting, please visit my website, colbypierce.com, where you can book an appointment. Epilogue. I want to share a few brief thoughts about the inception of Cycling in Alignment. The purpose of this podcast is for me to get 3.5 decades of hard-fought lessons out of my skull. Some of them through my own research and reading. Some of them I've been taught through mentors and colleagues, other riders, other racers. A lot of it, a massive amount of it, was simply trial and error through my own stubborn methods. And that has amassed a certain amount of experience and knowledge, understanding. And while I think I'm reasonably smart and I know quite a bit of stuff, I want to make it clear that the opinions that I share on this podcast are belief systems built on what I've experienced to this point. And that some of those opinions are pretty strong, but they are also loosely held. That is to say that if I learn more about a topic and have a greater level of clarity or understanding, then my old belief systems will be abandoned and I will now operate under that newfound knowledge. So I'm not here to tell people all the things that I know. I'm here to explain what I've learned to this point. And there's a big difference. Also, that is the intent when I discuss things on the pod with guests, is to learn from them and have a discourse. Because if we can't have a discourse as adults, then we've lost one of the basic tenets of modern society. Even if we disagree, we ought to be able to, in most cases, shake hands and walk away. Because after all, this is sport we're talking about, and while sport is training for life, it's nothing to get too upset over. The purpose of the podcast is to help me help other people, and specifically to help them actualize their highest potential by illuminating a path that enables alignment with their truth, their intent, and their coherence. That's really the end goal. So I'm grateful for your listening. My intent is also not, to be clear, to gain an audience or become popular or gain social status in any way. I don't care about that stuff. That said, if you feel an episode that you have heard will help someone you know, please share it with them. That helps us reach the end goal, which is to help more people. Thank you for listening. I'm grateful for your time and attention. Blessings.